Somewhere in the basement of a museum in Liverpool, England, a ceramic pot sat on a shelf for over 100 years. Inside it, knees folded to his chest, lay a man who had been dead for 4,500 years. He had been excavated from a limestone hillside south of Cairo in 1902, catalogued, shipped across the Mediterranean, and then largely forgotten. He survived 2 world wars. He survived Nazi bombing raids that leveled the street outside the building. He survived a century of being no one in particular, not a pharaoh, not a priest, not a general, just a man in a pot, undisturbed, while the world debated endlessly above him about who had built the most famous structures in human history. Then, in 2025, a team of scientists drilled into his teeth. And what came out of that drilling ended one of the longest arguments in the history of archaeology. The textbooks will tell you the pyramids were built by slaves, hundreds of thousands of them dragged from across the ancient world, whipped under the desert sun, worked to death on the Nile's western bank. That image lives in every Hollywood epic, in every school classroom, in the popular imagination of the ancient world assembled over 2,000 years of repeated telling. It traces back to a single source. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Egypt roughly 2,000 years after the pyramids were built and recorded what he was told by local guides. He was writing in the 5th century BC about events from the 26th century BC. He had no access to the workers. He had no access to their records. He had the stories Egyptians told tourists. For 2 millennia, those stories shaped the entire framework through which the pyramids were understood. The slave narrative, the whip, the suffering, the colossal injustice at the heart of the ancient world's greatest achievement. Then the DNA came out of the teeth, and almost everything about who those builders were, where they came from, and what their descendants are doing right now turned out to be different from what anyone had been taught to believe. To understand what the genome revealed, you first have to understand what it was competing with. Because the slave narrative was not just a popular myth, it was an organized interpretation with institutional defenders and 2,000 years of literary repetition behind it. Herodotus wrote that Khufu, the pharaoh who commissioned the Great Pyramid around 2560 BC, had enslaved his own people to build it, forcing them to labor in shifts of 100,000 men, rotating every 3 months for 20 years. The numbers were probably exaggerated even by ancient standards. But the picture Herodotus painted, mass coerced labor, a people crushed under the weight of a monarch's ambition, proved irresistible to every culture that came after. The Roman writers repeated it, medieval Arab historians elaborated on it, and when the modern study of Egyptology began in the 18th and 19th centuries, European scholars largely accepted the slave framework as the logical explanation for a project of such extraordinary scale. Who else but slaves could have moved 2.5 million blocks of stone, some of them weighing up to 80 tons, across the Giza Plateau and stacked them to a height of 480 feet? The mathematics of the thing seemed to demand coercion. Voluntary labor, the assumption went, simply could not have produced this. That assumption turned out to be both wrong and profoundly revealing about the people who held it. Because what the archaeology of the last 4 decades has done, and what the DNA has now confirmed, is not just correct a historical error. It has reconstructed the actual lives of the men and women who built the pyramids in enough detail to recognize them as human beings, rather than instruments of a tyrant's will. And the picture that emerges is so far from the slave narrative that the distance between the two is almost a measure of how completely the framework had distorted the evidence. The first serious break in the slave narrative came from the ground, not from genetics, and it came from an unlikely source. In 1990, a tourist on horseback stumbled over a partially exposed wall at the base of the Giza Plateau, about 300 meters south of the Sphinx. The wall turned out to be the entrance to a tomb, not a royal tomb, not a nobleman's tomb, but a modest mud brick burial that would later be identified as belonging to one of the men who had built the pyramids above it. Egyptologist Zahi Hawass led the excavations that followed, and what the ground gave up over the next 2 decades fundamentally changed the question of who the pyramid builders were. Not far from where that first tomb was found, archaeologists uncovered an entire city. Hayt el Ghurab, they called it, the Wall of the Crow. Though it would come to be known in popular accounts as the lost city of the pyramid builders, it was vast. The foundations of long gallery-style buildings that had housed rotating crews of workers, industrial-scale bakeries capable of producing thousands of loaves of bread every single day, breweries, fish processing facilities, storage magazines, a royal administrative building, and a workers' cemetery stretching across the sandy terrain southeast of the pyramids, where hundreds of individuals had been laid to rest with the goods they would need in the afterlife. These were not the remains of a slave camp. They were the remains of a city. The scale of provisioning was extraordinary. Hawass's team calculated that the state had been sending roughly 21 cattle and 23 sheep to the workers' city every single day during the main construction period. The bones of those animals, thousands of them, were found in the refuse deposits of the settlement. Someone was feeding this workforce at a level that would have been remarkable even by royal standards. The workers ate beef and goat, fish and bread, received rations of beer. They were not being starved into submission, they were being sustained. The tombs of the workers who died on site told the same story from a different angle. They were buried with the goods they would need in the afterlife, which in Egyptian belief was the same as what you needed in this one: food, tools, the basic equipment of a working life. They were buried in the fetal position, facing east as Egyptian custom required. They were buried with enough care that the people who prepared them for burial clearly believed their lives had mattered. And above all, they were buried in the shadow of the pyramids they had built within sight of the pharaoh's own eternal home. That placement was honor, not accident. In ancient Egyptian belief, proximity to the king's tomb and death was a form of blessing. It was the last privilege the state could grant its workers, and it was granted. The skeletons themselves had more to say. Analysis of the bones showed degenerative arthritis in the lumbar spine and knees, consistent with heavy lifting sustained over years. Healed fractures in the arms and legs, set with what the physical anthropologists described as good clinical technique. The bone realigned and stabilized so effectively that it healed straight. 2 cases of successful amputation of a leg and an arm, in which the healed bone ends indicated the patients had survived the procedure. Evidence of trepanation, the surgical opening of the skull, with bone regrowth indicating the patients had lived through it. A medical infrastructure sophisticated enough to perform brain surgery on pyramid workers and keep them alive afterward was not the infrastructure of a slave operation. It was the infrastructure of a state that valued its workforce enough to invest in their survival. The slave narrative had been built on the assumption that the scale of the pyramids required slave labor. The workers' city proved the opposite. The scale of the pyramids required organized, skilled, well-fed, medically supported professional labor. The Egyptian state had provided exactly that. But there was still a question the archaeology could not answer, a question that had been growing more pointed as the physical evidence accumulated. We knew where the workers lived, we knew what they ate, we knew how their broken bones had been set. What we did not know, what no amount of pottery analysis or architectural survey could tell us, was who they actually were at the biological level, where their families had come from, what their ancestry looked like in the genome, whether the people working the quarries at Giza were a homogeneous Egyptian population, or whether the pyramid project had drawn people from across a much wider world. For that answer, you needed the DNA. And for most of the history of Egyptology, extracting ancient DNA from Egyptian remains was essentially impossible. The problem was the climate. Ancient DNA degrades. Heat accelerates that degradation dramatically. Egypt, one of the driest and hottest environments on Earth, is among the worst possible places on the planet for the long-term preservation of genetic material. The same desert conditions that had perfectly preserved the physical forms of the mummies, desiccating their tissues before they could decay, had also cooked their DNA into fragments so short and so damaged that earlier sequencing technologies could not read them. Nobel Prize-winning geneticist Svante Pääbo, who had pioneered ancient DNA analysis and would later sequence the Neanderthal genome, had tried and failed to extract readable DNA from Egyptian mummies in the 1980s. The fragments were there, but the damage was too severe. The contamination from thousands of years of handling too extensive. The technology not yet powerful enough to assemble something coherent from the wreckage. For decades, ancient DNA research transformed the understanding of prehistoric populations across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, while Egypt sat largely outside the frame. The civilization everyone most wanted to understand genetically was the one the tools could not reach. Then the tools improved. The breakthrough came from an approach that turned the climate problem partially on its head. Rather than searching for DNA in the soft tissues of mummies, where heat degradation had done the most damage, researchers began focusing on dental material. Teeth are the most structurally dense biological tissue in the human body. Their enamel and dentine protect the genetic material inside from the same environmental exposure that destroys soft tissue DNA. Inside a tooth sealed inside a ceramic pot for 4,500 years, in conditions of low humidity and stable temperature, enough DNA could survive in readable fragments to reconstruct something approaching a complete genome. Dr. Adeline Morez Jacobs at Liverpool John Moores University and her team applied exactly this approach to the man in the pot from Nuweirat. They drilled into his teeth, extracted the material, and used next-generation sequencing to assemble the fragments into the oldest complete ancient Egyptian genome ever recovered. The result was published in Nature in 2025, and the data it contained was the first direct biological evidence of who the people of the pyramid-building era actually were. The man from Nuweirat had lived between 4,500 and 4,800 years ago. That range places him squarely in the Old Kingdom, the period when the step pyramid of Djoser was rising at Saqqara, and Khufu was planning what would become the Great Pyramid of Giza. He was not himself one of the Giza builders. Nuweirat is more than 150 miles south of Giza, and the researchers were careful not to overreach the evidence. But he was alive when the pyramids were being built, living in the same country, eating the same food from the same Nile-fed fields, breathing the same air of the civilization whose greatest monuments were going up to the north. What his genome showed was a profile with two distinct ancestral components. The dominant one, comprising roughly 80% of his ancestry, was North African and Nile Valley in origin, a genetic signature consistent with the populations who had been living along the Nile for thousands of years before the pharaonic civilization began. This was the deep indigenous substrate of Egyptian identity, the lineage that had worked the floodplain and developed the agricultural and ceremonial practices that would eventually become one of the most sophisticated civilizations the ancient world produced. The second component, comprising roughly 20% of his ancestry, traced to the Fertile Crescent, to Mesopotamia, to the river valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates, more than 1,000 miles to the northeast, where the other great urban civilization of the ancient world had been developing in parallel with Egypt for centuries. This was not a faint statistical signal. It was a robust genetic contribution that registered clearly in the data, and its implications were significant. The pottery wheel, the technology that had transformed the production of ceramic vessels across the ancient world, first appeared in Egypt at almost exactly the time this man lived. The earliest Egyptian script showed structural similarities to Mesopotamian pictographic writing systems. Archaeological evidence of trade goods, administrative seals, and architectural motifs had long suggested that the two civilizations were in much closer contact than their physical separation implied. What the genome confirmed, for the first time in a biological rather than an archaeological sense, was that the contact was not just commercial. People had moved. The DNA in the new Nuerat man's teeth was not the genetic echo of traded goods or borrowed ideas. It was the record of actual human movement, of individuals who had left Mesopotamia and settled along the Nile and had children whose children's children would live to see the pyramids rise. The Francis Crick Institute's Pontus Skoglund, one of the study's collaborators, described it as the first direct genetic evidence of what archaeology had long suspected, that the emergence of pharaonic civilization was not a closed, self-generating process. It was a connected one. The world that built the pyramids was a world already integrated with its neighbors in ways that left marks not just in the material record, but in the bodies of the people who lived it. The genome of the man from Nuerat was the first, but it was not the last piece of the biological evidence. And the picture that emerges from the accumulated data across multiple studies is one that speaks directly to the question that has never stopped being asked. What happened to the people who built the pyramids? Where are they now? For decades, this question was shadowed by a related one, rooted in the same 2 millennia of distorted popular history that had produced the slave myth. Because if the pyramid builders were slaves drawn from across the ancient world, then the modern population of Egypt would have no particular connection to them. The slave narrative implied a discontinuity, a borrowed workforce exploited and then discarded, whose genetic contribution to the modern population would be diluted to insignificance by thousands of years of subsequent migration and conquest. Greeks, Persians, Romans, Arabs, Ottomans, Egypt had been governed by outside powers for most of the last 2,500 years, and the assumption embedded in the slave narrative was that each wave of conquest had progressively replaced the original population. The DNA says that assumption was wrong, comprehensively, measurably, and definitively wrong. A landmark study published in 2017 and built upon by subsequent work had already analyzed the partial genomes of 90 ancient Egyptian mummies, spanning a period from roughly 1400 BC to 400 AD. From the New Kingdom through the Ptolemaic and Roman periods. That study found that the mummies showed genetic profiles consistent with ancient populations from the Near East and the Nile Valley, with minimal sub-Saharan African ancestry, and that this profile remained remarkably stable across 14 centuries of foreign occupation, Greek rule, Roman rule, and the beginning of Arab governance. The conquests had changed the administration of Egypt. They had changed the language spoken in its cities and the gods worshipped in its temples. They had not, to any substantial degree, changed the genome of its people. Then in April 2026, Egypt published the results of its own national genomic project. The study sequenced the complete genomes of 1,024 living Egyptian citizens drawn from across 21 of the country's 27 governorates. What the researchers found was a distinct genetic component present in modern Egyptians that they described as Egyptian enriched, a signature that distinguished the Egyptian population from neighboring populations in the surrounding region and that traced, at a measurable proportion of approximately 18.5%, to the ancient Egyptian ancestral profile established in the oldest genomic data. The number is not a ceiling, it is a floor. The 18.5% figure represents the component of modern Egyptian ancestry that carries a distinct and specifically Egyptian genetic signature, not shared with the populations of the surrounding region, traceable to the ancient Nile Valley population. The rest of the genome carries the accumulated contributions of the Near Eastern, Mediterranean, and African populations that have interacted with Egypt across 4,000 years of complex history. But the ancient core is there. It has not been erased. It has been measured. The people who built the pyramids are genetically present in the people who live in Cairo today, not as myth, not as cultural inheritance, as biology, as actual DNA sequenced from living bodies and traced backward through population genetics to the same ancestral stock that was already established along the Nile when the first pyramid foundations were being laid. When you hold the slave narrative against the evidence now available, what is most striking is not the factual error at its center. It is the way the error was maintained for 2,000 years in the face of evidence that contradicted it. The tombs of the workers existed. The workers' city existed. The bones with their healed fractures and their surgical interventions and their burial goods existed. None of this was hidden. The Giza Plateau is one of the most extensively excavated archaeological sites in the history of the discipline. Zahi Hawass's team began uncovering the workers' city in 1988. The tombs with their surgical evidence were documented and published. The cattle bones and the bakery remains, and the administrative records were there to be read by anyone with access to an Egyptological journal. And yet the slave narrative persisted, not because the evidence supported it, it never really did, even before the genome, but because the narrative had been established for so long by a source as authoritative as Herodotus, and repeated so consistently across so many centuries of Western writing about Egypt that it had become effectively immune to correction by physical evidence. The story was too old and too well known to be displaced by archaeology. It took the genome to do it, not because the genome was the most important evidence. The workers' city and the surgical bones and the burial records were more than enough to dismantle the slave story on their own, but because the genome arrived in a cultural moment when ancient DNA results carried a particular authority that no amount of pottery sherds and mud brick foundations could match. When a paper in Nature says the pyramid builders were not slaves, it breaks through in a way that a stratigraphic report from the Giza Plateau does not. The slave narrative required a specific kind of pyramid builder, uprooted, disposable, not Egyptian in any meaningful ancestral sense, people through whom no thread of inheritance ran forward into the modern population. The genome describes the opposite. The man from Nuweirat was local. His teeth showed he grew up in the Nile Valley, eating the wheat and barley and legumes of Egyptian farming. He worked hard enough and long enough that his spine and knees recorded it. He died old enough to develop osteoarthritis and a large tooth abscess. He was buried with care in a sealed ceramic vessel in a rock-cut tomb in the hillside. He was brown-eyed, brown-haired, dark-skinned, exactly as the population that had lived along the Nile for thousands of years before him had been. And he carried in his genome a Mesopotamian contribution that connected him not to the margins of civilization, but to its most dynamic center, the same interconnected ancient world that had traded pottery wheels and pictographic scripts and agricultural techniques across the 1,000 miles between the Tigris and the Nile. He was not a slave, he was a person. And the people of modern Egypt carry a measurable fragment of whatever he was in their own genomes, 4,500 years later. There is one more layer to this story, and it is the one that makes the whole picture complete in a way that purely archaeological evidence never could. The question of why the pyramid builders built the pyramids, voluntarily, at enormous physical cost, under a system that worked them so hard their spines were arthritic by middle age, is one that the slave narrative answered with coercion, and that the archaeological evidence answers with something more complex. The workers' city was not just a logistical facility. The graffiti left by the work gangs in the construction chambers of the Great Pyramid, discovered when Egyptologist Zahi Hawass photographed previously unseen internal chambers, included names the gangs had given themselves, the Friends of Khufu, the Drunkards of Menkaure. These are not the self-designations of a coerced labor force. They are the boast names of men who identified with the project they were part of, who took enough pride in their work to write their affiliation on the stones they were setting in place. The Egyptian concept of the pyramid was not primarily architectural. It was cosmological. The pyramid was the mechanism by which the king became a god. And the king's transformation into a god was not a private event. It was the engine of cosmic order. The sun rose because the king had rejoined the sun god. The Nile flooded because the divine order had been maintained. The workers who built the pyramid were not just laborers constructing a tomb. They were, within the belief system of their civilization, participants in the maintenance of the universe. Working on the pyramid was a religious act of the highest possible order. It was an honor, and the burial rites they received afterward reflected that honor. The DNA cannot read belief systems. It cannot reconstruct what a man from Nuweirat thought about the gods or about his place in the cosmic order, but it can tell you that he was indigenous to the Nile Valley, that he was connected through his Mesopotamian ancestry to a wider ancient world, that he worked a physical trade that wore itself into his bones, and that a measurable fragment of his genetic inheritance is still present in the bodies of the people who live along the same river today. Return to the ceramic pot on the shelf in Liverpool. The man inside it, knees folded, waiting out a century and a world war, and a quiet digital revolution in the science of ancient DNA, until the tools existed to read what his teeth had been preserving all along. He was alive when the pyramids went up. He was connected to Mesopotamia through his ancestry, to the Nile Valley through his diet and his bones, to a civilization building the most ambitious structures the ancient world had ever attempted. His body carries the record of both the individual life and the larger story. A hard-working man who lived long enough to be arthritic, who was buried with care, whose DNA survived 4,500 years of Egyptian heat inside the biological vaults of his own teeth because someone sealed him in good clay and someone else drilled into it with 21st century equipment and read what was inside. The slave narrative lasted 2,000 years on the strength of one historian's second-hand account. The genome overturned it on the strength of one man's preserved teeth. The people who built the pyramids were not slaves. They were skilled, organized, medically supported, well-fed laborers who were proud enough of their work to name their gangs after their king and honored enough to be buried in his shadow. They were Egyptians, connected to the deep Nile Valley population through most of their ancestry, and to the wider ancient world through the Mesopotamian thread that was already woven into the Egyptian gene pool by the time the first stone was cut. And their descendants are in Cairo right now, not metaphorically, biologically, with 18.5% of the modern Egyptian genome carrying a specifically ancient Egyptian signature that no amount of conquest or migration or 4,000 years of complex history has been able to fully erase. The pyramids were built by the people who lived beside the Nile. Their children's children's children still do. The only thing that was ever enslaved in this story was the truth, and now, from inside a dead man's teeth, it has finally come home.